downtown Dallas in a crime that has been debated and investigated innumerable times. The controversy about the murder was discussed again at a conference at Duquesne University this week. A security guard who rode behind the president all those years ago made a significant revelation about the assassination day. I'll hear a report from that conference. And finally, in this first hour, I'll be joined by the biographer of Baroness Falkender, also known as Marcia Williams, who was Harold Wilson's famous, if not infamous, political secretary. She was excoriated by Wilson's cabinet and by civil servants. Linda McDougall is the widow of Labour MP Austin Mitchell, and her new book challenges that portrayal of Marcia Williams, as well as recreating in sumptuous detail the intrigues within Harold Wilson's governments. All of that to come, but first your news headlines with Aaron Armstrong.
Thanks, Michael. Good morning to you. It's 2 minutes past 11. I'm Aaron Armstrong in the GB Newsroom. The Chancellor says the government's acting responsibly amid suggestions tax cuts will be announced in next week's autumn statement. Jeremy Hunt says he won't introduce any kind of measure that risks fuelling inflation after it was halved over the past year. Speaking to GB News, the Chancellor hinted inheritance and business taxes could be slashed in an effort to boost the economy, but insists next week's autumn statement will focus on growth.
We're not going to do anything irresponsible, particularly by which I mean anything that fuels inflation, because we had a big victory last week when we delivered the Prime Minister's pledge to halve inflation. When he and I came to office, it was over 11%. Now it's 4.6%. People watching at home, their number one concern, they say in poll after poll, is the cost of living crisis. This makes a difference. So we're going to do this responsibly.
Well, Labour's criticised suggestions the government may cut taxes while squeezing the welfare system when many people are struggling with the cost of living. Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Darren Jones, says he wants to know how any tax cuts will be paid for.
We've said in the Labour Party that we want the tax burden to come down on working people. It's the highest it has been since the Second World War. We've had 25 Conservative tax rises in this Parliament alone. But we can only announce those tax cuts when they can be fully funded. And if the Chancellor is going to announce a tax cut on Wednesday, we're going to be looking at how he's been able to get the money to pay for that to happen.
Homeowners could be offered up to £1,000 per year off their household bills if they're prepared to live near new electricity pylons. The government's hoping the move will overcome planning objections and speed up its bid to install new power networks. The current estimate for the rollout of the infrastructure needed for electrical vehicle charging points is 14 years. It could be worth up to £10,000 over a decade for some, although the Treasury hasn't specified where the money will come from. 700,000 pupils in England are still being taught in poorly maintained or potentially unsafe buildings because of crumbling concrete. The Public Accounts Committee says the deterioration in schools is limiting students' educational achievements. MPs say a shocking lack of detail from the Department of Education means the true state of the crisis remains a mystery, and they've described the condition of some classrooms as alarming. But the cross-party panel says a shocking, we've done that, move on past that, and it remains a mystery. The Department for Education says its rebuilding programme, though, is ahead of schedule. Minibuses and electric vehicles have been sent to Albania as part of a deal to return foreign prisoners. The arrangement will see 200 Albanian nationals currently jailed in England and Wales sent back home for the rest of their sentence. The UK has also agreed to help modernise Albania's prison system. The overall deal is expected to cost around £8 million, which the government says will save money for Britain's prisons. Pro-Palestinian demonstrations are continuing after yesterday's National Day of Action. Protesters held sit-ins at major UK train stations calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, with some repeating the controversial "From the River to the Sea" chant, despite an increased police presence. More protests are expected today in Cambridge, Colchester, Derby and some parts of the capital. The World Health Organization has described the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza as a death zone. A joint UN team led by the WHO has assessed the hospital during a 1-hour visit following its occupation and evacuation by Israeli forces. The team says they saw evidence of shelling and gunfire and observed a mass grave at the hospital's entrance, which held the remains of 80 people. The biggest prostate cancer screening trial in decades begins today. After a £42 million funding boost, the innovative trial uses methods like MRI scans to detect prostate cancer much earlier. Thousands of men across the country will participate, with 1 in 10 to be from non-white communities who are most at risk. Oncologist Carol Sikora says it's good news.
Problem we've got is that men don't come forward. You know, women are much better at coming forward with symptoms. They access their GPs better. And as you know, it's quite a challenge to get to see your GP now. And many men with a few urinary symptoms just pack up. They get bored of the whole thing and don't bother. And so often prostate cancer is delayed. And that's the key. And this trial, which is called Transform, is about seeing how it can be applied to a real huge cohort, millions of men around the country.
Well, that's it for the moment. I'll be back with more very shortly, but now it's over to Michael.
Thank you, Aaron Armstrong. The week in politics started with a bang on Monday morning as Rishi Sunak reshaped his cabinet, sacking Home Secretary Suella Braverman and announcing the entirely unpredicted return to government of David Cameron. 7 years, 2 elections and 4 prime ministers since he resigned over Brexit. Those moves incensed the right wing of the Tory party, whom Braverman has rallied to her banner with stinging attacks on the Prime Minister. He suffered another blow when the Supreme Court declared his Rwanda scheme for offshore processing of illegal migrants to be unlawful. But the Prime Minister insists that he will change the law to make the policy judge-proof. I have here an excellent panel of observers. Adam Hawksby is the Deputy Director of the Onward think tank. Kevin Craig is a former Labour councillor and Chief Executive of PLMR Communications Agency. And Ella Whelan is a journalist and broadcaster. Adam, let's start with you. Where do you think the reshuffle now positions the Conservative Party on the political spectrum?
So I think there's been a big over-interpretation of what has occurred ideologically within the Conservative Party over the last week. So 2 big moves. Suella Braverman being removed from post. I don't think that was primarily about policy disagreements. That was about the fact that she'd penned this article that was out of step with the line the government wanted to take on the protest, was deliberately inflammatory and stoking tensions. And I think the Prime Minister was right to remove her from post. James Cleverly, who's gone into the Home Office instead, is hardly some centrist left-winger. He was right-wing enough for Liz Truss to put in her cabinet and is following through on a very similar policy line. The appointment of David Cameron, I think, isn't about a return to a 2010s coalition-era centrism, but is about the connections that he has on the international stage and his ability, therefore, as Foreign Secretary, to pick up the phone to a range of people that might not pick them up for another Conservative MP at a time when those relationships are really important. So, yes, this might be a reassertion of serious, moderate, grown-up government, and I think moving Suella Braverman to the backbenches was a reassertion of that. But I don't think this is a big move away from the political positioning of the government, which is grounded in that 2019 coalition of Tory voters, very different to the 2010 coalition.
It sounds like you, Adam, think that the appointment of David Cameron was a shrewd move. I mean, the arguments against that would be, firstly, he overshadows the present Prime Minister. Secondly, he brings quite a lot of baggage with him now, and the Labour Party is making something of that baggage. Thirdly, there are those who would argue that it's an outrage to have the Foreign Secretary in the House of Lords, particularly at a time of international crisis where he can't be questioned by members of Parliament. And let's face it, he didn't have brilliant relations with many members of the Tory party when he was in the House of Commons, and he'll have to have even less regard for them now that he's in the House of Lords.
So, on the third point about scrutiny, I think they'll find mechanisms, whether it's Andrew Mitchell being in the Commons or using select committees to make sure there is proper scrutiny of the role he's taking. I think that's perfectly possible. In terms of the baggage, both the political element, the fourth bit you talked about, and possibly what you're alluding to, some of the Greensill challenges, I think that is a real concern. And I think Labour are probably right to go after that and to attack that. That will have been considered at the point that he was put in post. I think both of those things are outweighed, and this is to your first point on overshadowing the Prime Minister. They're outweighed by the fact that far from outshadowing Rishi Sunak, what I think this will enable him to do is focus more squarely on the domestic agenda. It would be very possible in the year before an election, with the war in Ukraine and the increasing difficulties in Gaza, for the Prime Minister to be drawn to those events and move away from the domestic political agenda. So I actually think Cameron gives Rishi Sunak capacity instead of drawing away from him.
Kevin, from a Labour point of view, perhaps, what did you make of the reshuffle? Do you think the Labour Party, as it were, enjoyed it?
I don't think the Labour Party ever enjoys another reshuffle when they're not in power and a chance to make this country better. I think you articulated very nicely, Michael, all the reasons why recycling David Cameron is a very questionable and hard to fathom move. Do I think it will make any difference to the majority of people in this country, the majority of viewers and listeners today in their day-to-day lives? You know, it will do nothing. I mean, he's got questionable links with China. As you say, the lobbying scandal he was involved in was very, that doesn't look good. So I think it's another example of Conservative incompetence. The big picture is, is this country better than 13 years ago? That's it. And this is just noise. And the only thing that Labour would be enthusiastic about is the general election, Michael.
But does Labour think that the reshuffle has moved the Tories further to the centre? And let's say it does. Would it think that that improved the Conservatives' chances or made them worse?
No, I mean, Labour think that it's astonishing that there wasn't a Conservative member of Parliament in the lower house that could take on the role of Foreign Secretary. And as you alluded to, we now have a situation where the Foreign Secretary can't take questions in the primary chamber, and instead we've got Andrew Mitchell, who viewers and listeners may remember the calibre of this person is that he insults serving police officers. So that's where we are. And so Labour's view is, yet again, where is the integrity and morality that this country needs?
Ella Whelan, sorry to keep you waiting so long. What did you make of the reshuffle?
Well, actually, Adam said that it's signalling something more grown up. And I think that it's actually probably just another exercise in musical chairs. At this point, we're sort of playing childish parlour games in Parliament, it seems, with no kind of vision and also no sort of future thinking. I mean, if you look at the Conservative Party dragging David Cameron out of his shed to, try and play around in foreign policy.
I mean, that wasn't a musical chair because he didn't have a chair.
No, but I mean, in terms of, you've got Sunak, who was appointed in a puff of smoke by Tory MPs. As you mentioned in the introduction, a string of prime ministers, all who have sort of increasingly tenuous links to the public. And there has been, I suppose I'm making the argument for a general election, but the point I want to make is that both parties, and the Conservatives, you have sort of harking back to Cameron, and, throughout the sort of Truss era, as short as it was, there was lots of discussions about Thatcher, and it's always sort of, if only we could get back to some previous time when it was great, supposedly, and more sensible and more grown up, we'd fix the problems of today. And then the Labour Party, you've got, sort of just a constant attempt to rehabilitate Blair, very sort of dull politics from Keir Starmer with nothing. To me, actually, it seems nothing drastically different from the Conservative Party in terms of, even if you want to look at the spat over Cameron being in the Lords, well, what do you want to do about that, parties? Do you want to abolish the Lords? Let's hear it. And obviously, we know that Keir Starmer's, got a bit of a...
Don't put a peer as Foreign Secretary, so you can't get asked. There's a specific answer. Don't put a peer as Foreign Secretary, so they can't be held to account.
I think most people would agree with that, but if you've got a problem with people not being held to account, when someone asks you then, well, what do you think about the House of Lords itself?
Different question.
Starmer starts to sweat. And I think that there's an issue here, which is that, you said, is this country better today than it was 13 years ago? It's been getting steadily worse for decades. The Conservative Party has done nothing good for the economy, for people's quality of living, for people's aspirations, jobs, or whatever else. The Labour Party hasn't either in the period of time in which it was government. There's no suggestion that when it would get...
13
Listen,
years.
If you'd let me
we have a nice polite programme here.
Yeah, let me, as the only lady on the panel, finish the sentence, please.
Oh.
Which is that I think in relation to if gender is relevant, questions about stuff that I care about, women's rights, issues around childcare, family, all the rest of it, both parties very lacking. So from your average Joe and Jane sat at home, who's probably not cheering on the appointment of Cameron, probably not that excited, as we can tell from recent election wins by Labour, by the prospect of a Labour Party. The sort of mood is that there's going to be potentially low turnout in the next general election, and most people sort of doing that with their vote, like having to pick the worst out of a bad bunch. That's a depressing prospect for me.
Let me bring back Adam. I thought Kevin asked a very good question. In fact, he said it was the fundamental question. Are we better off than we were 13 years ago? What's your answer to that?
I think it is difficult to point to substantial progress on the things that the Conservatives said that they would deliver, particularly after 2016. So let's keep in mind that in 2010, the Conservatives inherited an economy that was in crisis. That was both because of international events and partly because of the way that Labour had managed the economy, particularly in the second half of the noughties. And I think good work was done in 2010 to 16 to get us back onto a stable footing. Huge mistakes were made, I think particularly some of the cuts to local government, which lead to some of the impacts that I think Ella was describing. But got us into a position where in 2016 we had the financial firepower to do things like the furlough scheme. The problem is that in 2016, the Conservatives said that not only was the Brexit vote a vote to leave the EU, but it was a vote to fundamentally transform the country, particularly our economic model, to make it one that works for everyone and all places. The levelling up agenda in 2019 was a version of that, was a pledge, was a promise, was a vision that really chimed with me and my form of politics. And since then, yes, admittedly there was a pandemic in the way, there hasn't been enough of a pivot towards that form of politics, towards the really ambitious economic programme we needed, and actually some of the really tough action on social issues. Immigration is one of those where I think we needed more.
I'll say to Kevin very clearly, I think it's very difficult to argue that things are better than they were 13 years ago. Shall we just have a word about the Labour Party, though, Kevin? The split over the Middle East, over Gaza, Starmer has held the line. He's been quite courageous. I don't think he's going to move the line now. Is this indicative of a broader split within the Labour Party? And is this going to be a big problem for him as he runs towards the election?
I don't think so, Michael. I think he's shown that he is more than capable of being a good Prime Minister. He has taken the right line. It's not the right time to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. I think most emotionally intelligent human beings are shocked and appalled at any death in the Middle East. But he understands why Israel is taking the action that it has taken, albeit he's calling for humanitarian pauses. But he has shown the Labour Party he'll put the country first. And that, for me, is really important. I think he's shown he's fit to be a Prime Minister.
I confess, Ella, that I've been a little bit impressed by Keir Starmer over the Gaza question. How about you?
Yes, I completely agree with Kevin. I mean, it comes down to the fact that they're using the word ceasefire as a nonsense at the moment. What you really mean if you're asking for Israel to engage in a ceasefire is for Israel to surrender. I mean, that to stop and allow what everybody knows will happen, which is that Hamas has every intention of committing further atrocities, butchering more Jewish babies. So, at that, I think that he has shown a level of bravery in trying to face down some of the criticism from within his own party. What I will say, though, you get kind of whiplash with the Labour Party, which is that for a very long time they've had a problem with anti-Semitism, that Keir Starmer has gone some way to trying to fix that, but trying to please one side of its party for a very long time. Now it sort of flips and tries to please another side of its party. It's incredibly divided, and if he can't convince large sections of not just its members and its MPs, but also its voters, of the reason why he's taking this stance that doesn't look good for a next election.
Well, I mean, parties are divided. That's more or less a fact of life. I mean, they're very, very broad coalitions. I don't think why. I find no surprise.
You've got very reasonable as you've got older. You've really changed, I tell you.
Thank you very much, Kevin Craig, Ella Whelan and Adam Hawkesby. Don't go away. We'll be talking about Shakespeare, the JFK assassination and the governments of Harold Wilson. And I'll be asking, how does Britain return to building?
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Ah!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels we're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. If it seems to you that Britain is simply incapable of constructing anything anymore, whether due to environmental objections, red tape, incompetence or expense, you're not alone. Sam Richards spent 3 years as an advisor in 10 Downing Street and left with the insight that the odds are stacked against politicians who want to build. A year ago, he founded Britain Remade, a think tank and campaign group devoted to reducing the costs, both financial and political, of creating infrastructure in the United Kingdom. On the first anniversary of the organisation, he joins me to discuss its progress. Sam Richards, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Tell me what the consequences are if Britain does not build sufficient infrastructure.
So we think that Britain is an absolutely great country that built the world's first railway, the world's first coal-fired power station, and the world's first nuclear power station. But we haven't built a new nuclear power plant in this country for 28 years. Over the course of this decade, on current trends, we are currently already, the typical British family is poorer than a typical American family, poorer than a typical German family. And by the end of this decade, if we continue our failure to build new infrastructure and new industries, the typical British family will be poorer than the typical Polish family.
How do you know there's that connection? How do you know that not having infrastructure makes us poorer?
Well, you can see it in the success of those countries to build the infrastructure that they need, and it's particularly the case on energy, right? So over the last year, the biggest issue that has faced households around the country, across the country has been the cost of their energy bill. It's also the case for manufacturers. I used to work at Nissan at the plant up in Sunderland, and one of the most important issues that they faced, the most biggest challenge in getting the next model of Qashqai built there, getting the next car built there, was the cost of energy. So we need, if we can bring down those energy costs by building the new sources of power, reducing the red tape on building new offshore wind, new nuclear, then we can make Britain a much more attractive prospect for investment.
Give me maybe one example of how much more it costs to build infrastructure here than somewhere abroad, and then go on to tell me why that should be the case, why that's happening.
So if you look at the difference between France and Britain, in France, high-speed rail costs 8 to 9 times less to build than it does in Britain. Part of that is because Britain is a denser country with less space to build, a small part of it. But it's also the case that we have gold-plated environmental impact assessments, so they have got longer and longer over years. The environmental impact assessment for an offshore wind farm off the Norfolk coast, which is it's a sizable offshore wind farm, but that document was longer than the combined works of Tolstoy and Proust. It really doesn't have to be like this. We're making it far too hard for ourselves to build those sources of nuclear energy and build those new transport links.
There also seems to be an absolute loss of control. I mean, the way the costs of Crossrail or HS2 escalated, and no one seemed to be responsible. The government seemed to be... All the government could do, apparently, was to cut the project. It couldn't actually control the project. What's going on there?
I think that's right. And I think that there's maybe a loss of connection with the private sector and not drawing on enough private sector expertise. Part of what we've tried to do with Britain Remade is to act as that bridge in between Whitehall and Westminster and the country. We've got now 20,000 supporters around the country, but have also been talking to over 200 firms over the last year to get their insights into how to drive down costs. I think that's a part of it.
Do you see anyone campaigning in this election to do what you want to happen?
I've been heartened by the fact that there has been this cross-party, actually, recognition on the need to make it easier to build. So Keir Starmer, in his conference speech, used that to say that the Labour Party wanted to back the builders and not the blockers. Now,
yeah, I don't care what people say. I want to know what they're going to do.
The devil will be in the detail. But, I mean, it's interesting, for example, the Labour Party policy of a 2030 zero-carbon grid. In order to do that, they are going to need to build a huge number of turbines and solar panels and pylons and nuclear power stations as well. But it's also the case that I know that the government is looking closely at how to speed up infrastructure, and I think they've just announced today, I haven't seen the details, but that they've announced that they might be giving households up to £1,000 off their energy bills if they host pylons nearby. And this is welcome.
That brings us, I'm sorry, briefly, to the question of NIMBYism. This is a big problem. Most people don't want any of these things happening where they are.
I think that's right, and that's why we need to change the incentives. So, for example, Octopus Energy have got a great scheme whereby if you host a wind turbine nearby, and when it's windy, you will then get 25% off your electricity bills. I think that's absolutely great. And we need more of these schemes to shift the balance and make sure that the people who host this infrastructure see the benefit from it.
I love that expression, hosting the infrastructure. It's like taking in a rescue dog or something. Thank you, Sam Richards.
Thank you.
To me, fair friend, you never can be old, wrote William Shakespeare in one of his sonnets. Perhaps that was on the minds of his friends when they decided 400 years ago to preserve his works so that they should achieve immortality. The first folio, published in 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death, contained 36 of his plays. Had they not been included, 18 of those works might have been lost forever, including Macbeth, The Tempest and Julius Caesar. To celebrate the 400th anniversary of the first folio and to explain its significance, Shakespearean actor Ben Crystal joins me. Ben, lovely to see you. Welcome to GB News. So tell us more about the significance of the first folio, please.
Well, I think myself and a lot of people might imagine that for Shakespeare's time in his writing process, you know, he's sitting there up in his garret, he has a writing quill, he's by candlelight, he's writing these amazing plays, he passes them on to his actors, and these original manuscripts survived beyond his death, and then they published them. But that's really quite far from the truth of the matter, because soon after he died, his actors realized that they'd lost half of his plays. The manuscripts were long gone. And in fact, because of the way that they rehearsed the plays, much like a modern orchestra, you know, if you're playing the double bass, you don't have the violinist's parts. If you're playing Romeo, you don't have Juliet's part. So none of the actors had copies of the full plays, and they would have had to reconstruct them like a jigsaw puzzle when they wanted to put the book together. So the fact that this collection of Shakespeare's plays exists at all is a bit of a miracle.
Yes, and do we know the process by which the first folio was put together? Did it mean they had to rush around collecting up these scraps of paper, these individual scripts? Is that how it happened? Or was there some consolidated version of plays that they went back to?
They had So copyright worked a bit differently back then. Shakespeare would have sold his plays to his actors. Then the acting company, when they were running low on money, could have sold the plays on to a publisher. So one of the jobs that Condell and Hemming, the editors of the first folio, two of Shakespeare's actors that had worked with him for 20 years, they had to do was go around to the publishers and argue back for the copyright that they'd sold. 18 of Shakespeare's plays had been published during Shakespeare's lifetime, but they weren't the sort of authorized versions. These were versions that the publishers had put out, and some of those editions were editions of the plays that had been stolen by other actors that had listened to them whilst they'd heard them, whilst they'd gone to see them, and had copied them out. And then the other 18, had to be found from all the actors that had, hopefully, that still their acting parts, their cue scripts, still tucked away at home.
Extraordinary. Ben, do you yourself make use of the first folio?
Oh, absolutely. And I should say, first of all, a lot of this name's being touted around an awful lot, and very few people know what it actually means. The folio means this. If you take a piece of paper and you fold it in half, you have 4 sides to print on. That's folio. It's the Elizabethan hardback, essentially. And if you fold it again, well, that's twice as many sides to print on for the same price, and that's quarto, or paperback, essentially. And this book, this collection of Shakespeare's plays, was one of the very first, not quite the first, but one of the very first playwrights' works to be published in such a glorious and glamorous edition. And we have actors that work with actors that work with actors, and go all the way back to 1660. And then there's this gap of knowledge because of the Puritan change and everything else. And so getting back to the working process of Shakespeare and his actors, well, that's something I do an awful lot in my work at the Shakespeare's Globe and the Shakespeare North Playhouse, where I'm an associate artist. We explore raising Shakespeare in the same time frame as Shakespeare's actors, which was about 2 or 3 days. And in these original practice buildings where they built the theatres as close as they can imagine it was like 400 years ago, we learn a lot about how to perform these plays, and sometimes we try with original practice costume or music or fighting. But in terms of the text, well, this book, this first folio, is, because it's edited by 2 of his actors, it's the closest we can get to Shakespeare and his process. So it's incredibly valuable to actors and to practitioners. And that being said, as authoritative as it might seem, it's worth remembering, first of all, that part of the reason why these plays weren't published in Shakespeare's time is that 80% of his audience couldn't read. And then the compositors, the typesetters, the people that put this book together, we know that there were 5 of them. We know that one of them was illiterate. And we also know that they would have had to typeset the plays upside down and back to front. So if you wanted to do to be or not to be, you'd start when you'd get a capital T from the top shelf, and then you get a lowercase o from the bottom shelf, and that's where uppercase and lowercase comes from in our modern typesetting. And you'd put the T in the bottom right, and then the O upside down, of course, and then the O, and then find a comma or what have you. And then you have these 5 men, one of whom was illiterate, who had to hydrate with beer, not water. So these guys were probably drunk. One of them was illiterate, and they were putting together these incredible works. So it is as close as we can possibly get to Shakespeare, but there's still some distance between us and him. But it's still one of the most valuable tools that we have in raising Shakespeare today.
Ben, amazing. You've explained really the miracle, I would say the miracle, of having the first folios with us today. Thank you very much, Ben Crystal. Wednesday will mark 60 years since the assassination of JFK. I remember the day very well. In scenes that are etched into the memory of the entire Western world, the United States president was shot while travelling through downtown Dallas in a motorcade while sitting next to his wife, Jackie. The murder has lost none of its power to shock and to confound investigators, as was proved by a remarkable conference at Duquesne University this week, entitled The JFK Assassination at 60, New Frontiers in Scientific, Medical, Legal and Historical Research. I'm joined by presidential historian Jim Robernaut, who attended the conference where a revelation about the day of the assassination was made. Jim, thank you very much for joining us on GB News. So the revelation was the discovery of a bullet by one of the security team on the day of the assassination. Tell us a little bit about that, please.
Yes, I've been working with this former Secret Service agent for the entire summer. He has a book out called The Final Witness. He was in the car right behind the limousine on the sideboard. He witnessed the assassination up close. When they got to Parkland Hospital, he was Jackie Kennedy's Secret Service agent. He went up and tried to get her to release the president. She had the president cradled in her lap. She would not let go of him. She didn't want people to see the condition of his head. And they finally convinced her to let go of him once one of the Secret Service agents took off his coat and put it over the president's head. So when she stood up, this guy's name is Paul Landis. He saw directly behind where the president had been sitting on top of the seat, a pristine bullet that had been just sitting there. And he picked it up and took it into Parkland and left it with the president's body in Trauma Room 1. This is the so-called magic bullet that people have talked about for 60 years. This is some of the biggest news since the Warren Commission. And it really disproves that what's called the single bullet theory, that one bullet went through JFK and then hit Governor Conley and caused all his injuries, including breaking bones, major bones, without having any damage. In fact, it hit JFK in the back, and it likely fell out when he was hit with the final blast. Or Jackie, you can see, has her hand right back where that bullet entry was, and she might have knocked it off herself, carried it on her clothing as she grabbed over the back of the limousine for part of the president's brain that had been blasted out.
But Jim,
and that's where this Secret Service agent found it.
But Jim, how can it possibly be that this testimony has not come to light in 60 years? How is it that this testimony was not put to the Warren Commission?
It's a great question, Michael. I've spent the whole summer with Paul Landis going over everything. First of all, in that week following the assassination, he wasn't thinking about that bullet at all. He was still on duty. They had this, amazing series of time where he barely slept. He had PTSD. The president's head exploding was in his head. And then they had this amazing funeral on Monday following the assassination, where all these figures, including Charles de Gaulle, Prince Philip, marched behind Jackie Kennedy. It was just a time of enormous stress. So he wasn't thinking about that bullet in that week. Once he was done, he thought the Warren Commission would ask him about this, and they never interviewed him. So they didn't get this information because they never came to talk to him. And he, frankly, wanted to just simply fade back into the background, which is what he did. And he just never felt comfortable coming forward because he was a little bit worried that he might have done something wrong. He finally got permission in about 2014 from a former Secret Service agent director who said, "You really got to get this out like yesterday." And that began his journey to write this book.
Jim, there was a whole conference at Duquesne University. Tell me a little bit about the sorts of things that were discussed other than Paul's testimony.
It was one of the most amazing conferences I've ever been to. Alec Baldwin came. Rob Reiner spoke by Zoom. Those two have been interested in the assassination forever. Rob Reiner has a brand new podcast out, 10-part series with Soledad O'Brien. But there were people there who had all sorts of expertise about audio information of what shots sound like and what people were hearing, and looking at the Zapruder film and seeing where people were looking. They had one guy who talked about the fact that after the autopsy, it may have been somebody else's brain that was autopsied other than JFK's, which, by the way, has been lost now to history. They can't find it anywhere. So it's an amazing murder mystery. It's the greatest murder mystery of history, and it continues to confound people. So it was a fabulous conference.
Jim Rebenalt, I wouldn't be surprised if we talk about this again. It just goes on and on. Thank you for joining us. In a few minutes, I'll be joined by Linda McDougall, whose new biography of Marcia Williams, Harold Wilson's political secretary, challenges the possibly sexist stereotypes that have surrounded her since the 1970s. Stay with us.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Was Margaret Thatcher the first woman to run things in 10 Downing Street? A new book suggests that she was not. A decade before Mrs Thatcher was swept to power, the government of Harold Wilson was being steered by his remarkable political advisor, Marcia Williams, later Baroness Falkender. Williams's relationship with Harold Wilson and the extent of her control over his governments created fevered gossip at the time, and she was later denounced by Wilson's male cabinet members. A new biography by Linda McDougall, an experienced journalist who is married to the late Labour MP Austin Mitchell, seeks to rescue Williams from the judgment of her male colleagues. And it's my pleasure to welcome Linda McDougall. Congratulations on the book. Now, there are descriptions of Marcia Williams ranting at her Prime Minister, bullying him, humiliating him. Why would she behave in such a way towards the Prime Minister? Why would the Prime Minister put up with this from his political secretary, do you think?
Well, I'm going to have to go back quite a way, because I would say that from 1964, when Wilson first became Prime Minister, up until the end of that Parliament in 1970, there was none. There's not a report you could find anywhere that says she did any of that. in my attempt to rebuild her reputation, to change her reputation, I want first of all to look at what she did to get Wilson into number 10, how she worked through that, those first two, because there was an election in the middle, how she worked through that parliament, and how she was before the arrival of Joe Haynes at the very end of that parliament.
He being the press secretary towards the end of the period, yes.
And not only the press secretary towards the end of that period, but really Marcia's main detractor for the rest of her life.
Let us go back then to how Marcia Williams met Harold Wilson.
Well, it's amazing, really. She left Queen Mary University in London and she got her very first job after having taken a shorthand typing course, because, of course, you will remember that in the 60s women couldn't do anything unless they learned how to shorthand and type first. So she did that and she got a job working in Labour Party HQ. She hadn't been there very long and she realised how far to the right she, as a young, just left being a student, how far to the right she thought the Labour Party was. And she was a bit right, because, of course, it was much to the right of where she might have been. And so what she did, she had a look around and she thought, well, really, we need someone on the left to lead this party. So she discovered Harold Wilson, who was at the time on a tour around Britain doing a big piece of research on local parties. And she thought he was marvellous, very impressive. So she started writing anonymous letters to him, telling him, this is what's going on in head office, this is what you need to watch out for, they're trying to get you, you deserve better than this.
Just remind me what sort of people they were who were trying to get him. These were, what, people like Tony Crossland?
Well, Crossland, Roy Jenkins and Gates School were all, well, Oxford graduates who were what Nadine Dorris would in those days, if she'd been there, have called posh boys.
Yes.
And Marcia certainly wasn't, and Harold certainly wasn't. They were from...
He was an Oxford graduate, but not a posh boy.
No, not a posh boy. Well, very much not a posh boy, because he came from Yorkshire and a family where Dad was pretty much unemployed when Harold got to Oxford. So he came from, let's just say, he was an ordinary bloke, and I think Marcia came from a pretty ordinary background too. So the point I'm making, though, it was pretty outrageous that she was so comfortable in her own skin that she would write that and that she would send it off anonymously. Anyway, her opportunity came when Khrushchev came on a very famous visit to Britain and was toured round by the Conservative Party, had a wonderful time, they all got on well together, and Labour got one night. And that one night, I can remember this because Joe Haynes drums it into anyone who wants to talk about it, was the 23rd of the 3456. Yeah. It was a date that ran in order, and that night they were invited to the House of Commons, and they had dinner in what's now the Churchill room, which you and I probably knew as...
the Harcourt room.
The Harcourt room, exactly. And this room was dedicated that night to entertaining them. And Marcia and one other girl were given the job. I say girl because that was what they were called in those days. They were the two girls in charge of doing the seating and taking notes. Marcia did this, and she recorded herself. She said she can never forget how wonderfully kind Harold Wilson was to her that night. He could see her hands trembling because she was so scared and nervous, and he was wonderfully kind and sympathetic. Now, a guy called Cornt, who was later to become Harold's Labour Party agent, he was there, and he said, it was the night, he said grandly, that Marcia and Harold fell in love with one another and began an affair which lasted for around 5 or 6 years.
And we don't know whether that's true or not.
Well, we know that Harold says, or has always denied it. We know that Marcia sometimes denied it. We know that one time she ordered Mary Wilson, Harold's wife, to come round to her front door, and she opened the front door and she shouted at her and said, 6 times back in the 1950s I had sex with your husband, and it was unsatisfactory. Now, why anyone should want to shout about their failed love affairs, I can't imagine, but there you go.
Outrageous. Now, we haven't got so very long. I'd like you to make 2 points. Why do you respect her so much? She did a lot, you say, for the Labour Party, for example.
Well, I think she got Harold into number 10. Don't forget, we weren't paying staff, we weren't paying people to do any work. There were no bucket loads of spads sitting around the place. No. Marcia was it. And she was the one person who really believed in Harold. And she worked her socks off, and she did so all through that first period. To get to the point you asked me originally, I think she became addicted to drugs. Yeah. She certainly, of her own accord, had a great deal of drugs that would make sure that she could work through the day, the sort that students take to stop them from keep falling asleep in the middle of their research. She took a lot of those, and then when Harold Wilson got himself a doctor, a medical advisor, he began to give her what we were all given in the 60s and 70s, bucket loads of benzodiazepines. And that's Valium. I mean, if you remember, because you will, the Rolling Stones' famous song, Mother's Little Helper.
That's what it is, yes.
Exactly. Doctor, please, some more of these, yes.
Let me bring in just the other point. So, extraordinarily, while she's working at number 10, she has an affair and she has 2 babies within 10 months of each other.
Yes, yes, indeed. That was in the first... To make it even more extraordinary, she had those 2 babies, first of all, by the political editor of the Daily Mail, Walter Terry, who was married to someone else. And she had those 2 babies in total secret. Nobody knew. Newspaper proprietors in those days were able to control much more what happened in their newspapers, and people like Lord Goodman made a huge effort and succeeded in keeping, until the marvellous arrival of Private Eye, which we didn't realise till we had Private Eye how much we needed it. Marcia's children were completely unknown about. It was her eldest child was 7 years old when Private Eye revealed the existence of these 2 children.
And we better very briefly mention the Lavender List. She wrote out a list of peerages and honours for Harold Wilson, on paper described as lavender, that probably was pink.
Yes, that's true. This is at the very end of their career in Downing Street, because it was when he resigned. And what I would say is now a scandalous misconception of what happened, because if you look into what's happened with peerages and things since, there was nobody on that list of Harold Wilson's who wasn't in some way involved with the Labour Party or with politics, or even more interestingly with show business, because this is where Lord Grade got his peerage. Harold wanted to give David Frost a peerage, but he didn't. I think he was dissuaded.
Linda, I'm going to cut you short there, and I'm sorry to do that, but it's a wonderful book. There we are, Marcia Williams, The Life and Times of Baroness Falkender by Linda McDougall. Thank you very much to you, Linda, for coming in. It's a cracker of a book. You're watching Michael Portillo on GB News, Britain's news channel. So ends the first half of the show. I'll be back on the stroke of noon to debate whether politics has been overtaken by gesture, and I'll examine some fine antiques ahead of a large fair which is set to take place in Birmingham next month. So stay with me. See you in a few moments.
OK.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. I'm Craig Snell. Well, looking ahead to the rest of Sunday, for most of us we are going to see some further rain. There'll be a little bit of brightness around, and for some of us it's going to be pretty blustery. It's all down to this area low pressure which has really lingered right throughout the weekend, bringing in some further pulses of rain. A more organised band of rain just moving across parts of northern England into the Midlands as we go into the afternoon. But for most of us, it's going to be a fairly grey picture. Best of any brightness really reserved across parts of eastern Scotland. As I mentioned, quite blustery too, especially down towards the southwest. But despite all of this, it is going to be a mild one. Temperatures in the south reaching around 14 or 15 degrees. Into this evening, we remain rather grey with some outbreaks of rain, keeping a close eye on this band of rain as it moves into parts of Wales and southwest England overnight. Could turn quite squally for a time, so you may well get woken up by some wind and rain as we go into the early hours of Monday. But for most, with the cloud and rain around, it is going to be another fairly mild one for the time of year. So going into Monday morning, that area of rain will sink its way in towards France as we head towards mid-morning. And generally, for most of us, it's going to be another fairly grey picture. We may well just see a brief sunnier interlude develop across parts of England for a time, but generally cloudy and damp as we start the new working week. But it's going to remain in mild.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Ah!
No, thank you. My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the second hour of Sunday with Michael Portillo. Let me sweep you into Sunday afternoon on a carpet of art, culture, history and good debate. Starting with debate, I will ask whether Britain's politics has become obsessed with gestures. This week, senior members of the Labour Party team resigned over a purely declaratory motion in the House of Commons that called for a ceasefire in Gaza. Meanwhile, the Conservatives continue to divide themselves over government immigration policy, which most experts believe will not stop the small boats, even if flights do one day take off for Rwanda. My panel will debate the popularity of political gestures. Just a few weeks ago, the King expressed his deepest regret for atrocities carried out by British forces in Kenya during the Mau Uprising. A new book, Trapped in History, Kenya, Mau and Me, explores that cruel conflict, both as a history and a personal memoir. Former BBC journalist Nicholas Rankin grew up in Kenya during the emergency. He will join me to discuss his book. Nick Fletcher is the Conservative Member of Parliament for Don Valley, who faced ridicule when he called for a Minister for Men. He chairs the all-party parliamentary group on issues affecting men and boys. Its new report examines how to close the educational attainment gap, as boys routinely underperform their female peers. He will join me to discuss that. And an antique dealer is bringing his wares into the studio ahead of a major new fair in Birmingham next month. The industry has been clobbered since COVID, with fewer buyers appearing at such shows. In the hope of reversing that, my guest will offer 500 free tickets to GB News viewers. All of that to come, but first your headlines with Aaron Armstrong.
Good afternoon. It's 12:minutes. Aaron Armstrong here in the GB Newsroom. The Chancellor says the government is acting responsibly amid suggestions tax cuts will be announced in next week's autumn statement. Jeremy Hunt says he won't introduce any kind of measure that risks fueling inflation after it was halved over the past year. Speaking to GB News, the Chancellor hinted inheritance and business tax could be slashed in an effort to boost the economy, but insists next week's statement will focus on growth.
We're not going to do anything irresponsible, particularly by which I mean anything that fuels inflation, because we had a big victory last week when we delivered the Prime Minister's pledge to halve inflation. When he and I came to office, it was over 11%. Now it's 4.6%. People watching at home, their number one concern, they say in poll after poll, is the cost of living crisis. This makes a difference. So we're going to do this responsibly.
Well, Labour's criticised suggestions the government intends to cut taxes while also squeezing the welfare system when many people are struggling with the cost of living. Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Darren Jones, says he wants to know how any tax cuts will be paid for.
We've said in the Labour Party that we want the tax burden to come down on working people. It's the highest it has been since the Second World War. We've had 25 Conservative tax rises in this Parliament alone, but we can only announce those tax cuts when they can be fully funded. And if the Chancellor is going to announce a tax cut on Wednesday, we're going to be looking at how he's been able to get the money to pay for that to happen.
Homeowners could be offered up to £1,000 per year off their household bills if they're prepared to live near new electricity pylons. The government's hoping the move will overcome planning objections and speed up its bid to install infrastructure for charging electric vehicles. The current estimate for that is 14 years. It could be worth up to £10,000 over a decade for some, although the Treasury hasn't specified where the money will come from. A woman who acted as a fixer for people smugglers has been jailed for 7.5 years. A 32-year-old Albanian woman helped arrange small boat crossings from France to the UK for Albanian nationals. Investigators found images on her phone linking her to 9 individuals who arrived by boat on British shores. She was arrested at home in Oxfordshire last year and will be deported upon release from prison. 700,000 pupils in England are still being taught in poorly maintained or potentially unsafe buildings because of crumbling concrete. The Public Accounts Committee says it's limiting students' educational achievements. In its report, the cross-party group described a shocking lack of detail from the Department of Education, meaning the true state of the crisis remains a mystery. The Department for Education says its rebuilding programme is proceeding ahead of schedule. A Conservative MP who was found guilty of racial abuse has announced he's standing down at the next election. Bob Stewart racially abused a man after he allegedly told him to go back to Bahrain outside the Foreign Office last December. He surrendered the Tory whip while he appealed against his conviction. The MP for Beckenham made no reference to the recent case but said it had been an honour and a privilege to serve. And the biggest prostate cancer screening trial in decades begins today. After a £42 million funding boost, the innovative trial uses methods like MRI scans to detect prostate cancer much earlier. Thousands of men across the country will participate, with 1 in 10 hope to be from non-white communities who are much more at risk. Oncologist Carol Sikora says it's good news.
problem we've got is that men don't come forward. You know, women are much better at coming forward with symptoms. They access their GPs better. And as you know, it's quite a challenge to get to see your GP now. And many men with a few urinary symptoms just pack up. They get bored of the whole thing and don't bother. And so often prostate cancer is delayed. And that's the key. And this trial, which is called Transform, is about seeing how it can be applied to a real huge cohort, millions of men around the country.
We are live across the UK on TV, digital radio, and if you want us on your smart speaker, you'll have to say, play GB News. Now it's back to Michael.
Thank you very much, Aaron Armstrong. The House of Commons vote this week calling for a ceasefire in Gaza could have absolutely no bearing on the course of the war in the Middle East. But it did have real consequences for Sir Keir Starmer, as 8 front benchers, including Jess Phillips, resigned in order to back the motion. Meanwhile, the Conservative Party is being torn apart over the government's policy to process illegal migrants in Rwanda, a move which arguably will not significantly affect the number of small boats crossing the Channel. With those examples in mind, I want to ask whether in British politics gesture has supplanted effective policy. And to answer that, I'm joined by the former Labour advisor Matthew Lazar and the Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill. To both of you, welcome back to this programme.
Thank you.
Matthew, let's start with you. Well, I gave the example of the Labour Party. Look, this vote was going to make no difference to what happened on the ground, and yet 8 people have kind of sacrificed their careers for it.
Totally. I mean, my instinctive reaction is that one, which is that there is a sort of pointlessness to a lot of gesture politics. But there is a counter-argument, which is quite strong, which is that one person's gesture is another person's conscience raiser, that they may not, either by resigning or doing, you know, by changing a Twitter banner, if you know, that we can all do, or wearing a badge for a particular cause, that may not be altering events or altering the course of that debate, but you are showing you are trying to raise consciousness, you're showing solidarity, which is, of course, a big word on the left, on my side of politics. So it's a fine line between the two, with a hollow gesture versus effectively raising the stakes for the cause that you want to support.
So that we can be sympathetic to the plight in which members of Parliament find themselves, describe to us some of the pressures that Labour MPs might have come under.
Well, they're absolutely extraordinary. And in fact, I think they're at the moment slightly underreported. I mean, so what we've seen over the last few days in particular, with a lot of MPs back in their constituencies on Friday and over the weekend, we've seen attacks on constituency offices. A friend of mine in London, she was incredibly frightened. She had to have 4 police officers outside her surgery, outside her office where she was trying to hold a surgery for the whole of Friday, with people posting onto the shutters, because the shutters had to come down, pictures of devastation in Gaza, as though she was personally responsible. And in particular, they're being called baby killers online, in the streets, and in person. But more than that, Michael, we're also seeing this extraordinary situation in Preston, where quite a lot of councillors have resigned, where a letter's gone from the local mosque, literally saying, you must resign, which frankly to me seems to be putting pressure on people in a public office. I'm not sure it's not only morally inappropriate, but I'm not sure that legally it's particularly sound either.
And tell me, I mean, obviously we are making this anonymous, but are you finding that people who are under that sort of extraordinary pressure have changed their position, or are you also seeing examples of people who, under that sort of pressure, are resisting and saying, no, I don't believe in the ceasefire, so I'm not changing my vote? Yeah,
absolutely. No, the people that I'm thinking of are people who haven't changed their vote. They've stood firm, which you have to say is incredibly brave of them, because it is, you know, it is both physically dangerous, but it's also terribly emotionally draining as well when it's within the party and people that you wish to regard as, to use that phrase for the Labour side, as comrades. So, I mean, you know, it is incredibly difficult, but people are standing firm. And of course, Keir Starmer himself has come under attack. His office has been under a siege, and he's had quite a lot of personal abuse, particularly because of his wife and his family's Jewish heritage. So not easy, but they're standing firm at the moment in most cases.
Henry, should we just turn to the Conservative Party for a moment? I mean, did you agree with my representation of the Rwanda issue as being something that I think is quite unlikely to bear fruit? But even if there are flights going to Rwanda, given the numbers of people involved and the number of people crossing the Channel, it seems to me quite unlikely that this is actually going to affect the migration problem as we perceive it. Or have I got that wrong?
I think you're broadly right. I think that Rwanda could have a bigger impact than some people imagine, because if you ever got it off the ground and there was a plausible chance that you might be sent to Rwanda, the crucial thing is that would encourage people to keep their documentation. Because if you're going to be sent to Rwanda anyway and you want to leave, you want to have your passport with you. If people keep their documents and don't throw them overboard in the Channel, it's actually much easier to deport them from here. One of the biggest problems faced by the Home Office is it's very difficult to get rid of people if their claim fails, if we can't prove who they are. But mostly, yeah, you're right. And I think there's an even bigger example of the gesture politics thing, which is the illegal migration bill. Passed in July, came into force in July. Anyone who comes here after that date, can't stay here, has to be deported. Got no mechanism to do it. There's a report in the Times today that the civil servants are advocating for giving tens of thousands of people an amnesty. So there is a real problem, I think, with the fact that because the government, successive governments, but particularly over the past few years, are really struggling to do the kind of hard structural work needed to get policy off the ground, you end up passing these kind of like deadlines and commands with no follow-through. And that is the definition of gesture politics, I think.
Yes, we've been calling it that. Suella Braverman was probably thinking of something fairly similar when she referred to magical thinking in her resignation letter. I thought she might have carried the day with that point. I mean, it does look to me as though there's been quite a lot of magical thinking in the government. Which means not having a plan B when you can pretty much foresee that you're not going to get through the Supreme Court.
Well, in fairness, the government didn't expect it to win. The government expected to win in the Supreme Court. The government won in the High Court. The Court of Appeal judgment was actually a bit of a surprise, and the grounds on which the Court of Appeal made that judgment were, I think, fairly shaky. The Supreme Court judgment was resounding, but the government wasn't expecting it. But the Home Office was warning from the beginning that there is a real danger that if you do this and it does lose, then you don't have a plan B, and the government doesn't have that. But you can see this all over the place. Net zero, I think, is another really obvious one. Rishi Sunak took a lot of flack for pushing back some of this country's net zero commitments on things like electric cars. But that was always going to happen, because you just had to ask yourself, is this country going to have the charging infrastructure in place in 7 years' time? Is this country going to have the energy generation, domestic energy generation, in place? No, of course it's not. And again, it's really easy for politicians to pass a deadline for just after their own political career is going to be over, right? And if we do somehow hit it, it's great. They were the visionaries who set the policy. And if we don't hit it, well, they were let down by their successors. But again, you need to do the infrastructure, and we didn't.
I think it's really decadent politics. Matthew, so I was talking to you about gesture politics, but now we've moved on really to effective policy making. Why is it that we don't seem to be able to make more effective policies? Is it because politicians are feckless? Is it because we don't have the infrastructure of civil servants? We don't have the expertise? Or maybe you don't agree with me that we don't have effective policy making.
I firmly agree with you that we don't have effective policy making. I mean, I think we've had a good example in the last 48 hours, which effectively proves both points, both gesture politics and ineffective policy making, which is the government floating that it's going to take away prescriptions, free prescriptions from those who don't spend Christmas Day, job seekers who don't spend Christmas Day looking for work. So if you're meant to be looking for work and you don't meet and it's literally sort of monitored how long you spend on you're going to take away your free prescriptions. That will have the exact reverse effect of what the government wants it to do, which is encourage people into work. Basically looking at a group of vulnerable people who aren't in work, who should be in work and need support, but the stick is not going to work. What you need is a proper carrot, because we all want to see them back into work. So rather than a joined-up thinking about how do you get this hardcore of unemployed people back into work, we have a nice headline that does well on the radio phone-in shows for 48 hours, but then sort of has to linger as a policy, which A, will probably never happen, and B, if it did happen, would do the exact opposite of what it did. And we do it because politicians are obsessed with the media. I'm a former spin doctor. I plead guilty to being, in a sense, part of that. But, the big question is how do you move from, a just chasing of short-term headlines? I mean, the argument is the news cycle in the age of social media has gone from being, 24 hours to being about 24 minutes. So, how long, how do you actually come up with serious, sensible, and in particular, I think we probably all agree on this, joined-up government, where you actually think about the whole of government and how it's going to work to achieve a goal, an aim.
I wonder, Henry, whether things haven't come around a bit, that people are not as stupid as many politicians think they are, and they can see a gesture, they can see something that's not going to be carried through. Are people not by now yearning to hear an effective way of tackling what they identify as problems? Things like immigration, things like housing, things like the National Health Service, for that matter.
I'm sure they think they are, but it's a bit like asking for politicians with conviction, right? Because the moment everyone wants a politician with conviction until you don't agree with them when they're out of touch and they're not listening. And I think that the real problem is the 24-hour media, 24-minute media is a malignance, no doubt about that. But the problem is that I think British politicians most of the real problems, serious problems facing this country in terms of its economy, in terms of the growing burden of the NHS, social care, immigration, all of these things are kind of big structural problems. All of them, and tackling them seriously would involve some honest conversations that most people aren't up for, and a hard discussion about trade-offs, right? We're not rich enough to pay for everything. There's a conception, I think this country, on average, thinks it's much richer than it is. And so politicians don't want to have that conversation with the public because the public would punish them for it. And we should be clear about this. Think about Theresa May in 2017, when she was like, look, social care is bankrupting local government. Why don't we ask people who have a large asset to contribute? And she threw away election when she was 25 points ahead in the polls. So the politicians can't ultimately, until the public is in a position, it's like Thatcher in the 70s, right? I think until things have got bad enough that the public are open to that kind of discussion, there's nothing the politicians can do except keep throwing people like us things to keep us distracted.
A wonderfully articulate discussion. I thank you both very much indeed. I think we may be reaching that point, however. So that was Matthew Lazar and Henry Hill. Thank you to them both. After the break, a new book on the Mau Mau emergency in Kenya, and it blends personal memoir with imperial history. I'll be joined by the author, so stay with GB News.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. I'm Craig Snell. Well, looking ahead to the new working week, we are going to start off rather grey and damp. For some of us, it will be drier midweek, but for all, it looks like it's going to turn colder as we head towards next weekend. Back to the here and now, we still are dominated by this huge area of low pressure. Note the tightly packed isobars indicating it's going to be fairly blustery as we end at Sunday. Quite a lot of cloud around with some outbreaks of rain, keeping a very close eye on this next area of rain, however, as it moves into parts of South Wales, southwestern England throughout the night. Could turn quite squally for a time. But with all the cloud and rain around, it's going to be another fairly mild one right across the UK. So we start Monday morning, potentially quite wet across parts of southern England, but that will clear off towards France as we head towards the middle part of the morning. That may briefly allow some sunnier spell to develop across parts of the Midlands, East Anglia for a time, but for a lot of the UK, it's going to be a fairly grey start to the new working week. Further outbreaks of rain, that may well be fairly persistent up across parts of northern Scotland. And with a northerly wind starting to develop, it will be slightly cooler than the weekend, but still on the mild side. Into Tuesday, another fairly grey picture for parts of England and Wales, risk of some outbreaks of rain in the east. Brighter and drier for Scotland and Northern Ireland. That will sink its way southwards into England and Wales as we go into Wednesday and Thursday.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this? It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. His Majesty King Charles made his first visit as head of the Commonwealth to Kenya 3 weeks ago, where he stopped short of apologising for the actions of British forces during the bloody Mau Uprising in the 1950s. He did, however, express his deepest regrets over the abhorrent and unjustifiable acts of violence that had taken place. Someone with a highly personal as well as an academic interest in the history of the emergency is the BBC former journalist Nicholas Rankin, who grew up in Kenya during the conflict, and his new book, Trapped in History, Kenya, Mau and Me, blends memoir and scholarship to create a vivid portrait of that fraught time. My great pleasure to welcome Nicholas Rankin. Good to see you on GB News. Who is trapped in history in the title of your book?
We all are. Mm-hmm. You are, Michael, I am, everybody is. But in this case, the quote is from James Baldwin, and he says that people can be trapped in a history which, if they fail to understand, they can never be free of. Now, I grew up I was a child in Kenya, and it was a turbulent time. The emergency, which the King referred to, 1952 to 1960, was an armed uprising against the British colony. The Mau emergency. Now, the term Mau wasn't actually an African term. It may be a distortion of the Kikuyu word for oath, Muma. It's not sure, but it was the term that the Europeans used to describe this movement, this armed uprising. And it was a very turbulent period, and it was a violent rebellion followed by violent repression, for which many of the things that the King expressed regret. You know, he said, there is no excuse, is what he said in Nairobi a couple of weeks ago.
So essentially, the Mau movement was a movement for independence, to throw over the British imperial rule.
Indeed. I mean, the history of Kenya is very recent in terms of, not in terms of world history. The whole human race evolved, we know with Leakey's discoveries out of East Africa, but in terms of white colonization, it's from the 1890s. And from the 1920s, you get a movement towards independence. Now, the fact is that there was a pyramid of dominance, if you like, in East Africa. You have, by the time we went there in the early 1950s, there's 50,000 white people, about 200,000 Asian people, Indians, people from Pakistan, all Indian, then called Asians, and then 5 million, more than 5 million African people. So Europeans, Asians, Africans. Now, why wouldn't 5 million people in their own country not want to get rid of the 50,000 people who are ruling them? Now, there was a constitutional way, but that got blocked. It wasn't understood. And if you repress legitimate means, you might get an explosion, and you did.
Let's briefly deal with the sort of violence on the two sides. What were some of the tactics of the rebels under the Mau Rebellion?
Well, here we're into the area of atrocity, Michael. Yes. I mean, the fact is that horrible things were done, okay? Chopping people and disemboweling people and horrible
massacres
things.
of families.
Massacres of these are the things that happen in warfare, you know, and all sorts of people are capable of it. It's disturbing stuff, Michael. It's disturbing to write about.
And what were the British forces?
Well, and then what
accused of
happens
in
is
return?
they were accused of detention, torturing people to see whether they could confess or whether they were mum or betray where other people were. So you get one kind of abuse leading to another kind of abuse.
And collective punishment.
Collective punishment.
Something we're familiar with at the moment as a concept.
Indeed. And this meant that if there was a murder, people's cattle would be taken away, their bicycles would be confiscated, people would be moved. There were all kinds of injustices and difficulties. People were locked up in detention camps. They were screened, as the term was, to find who was loyal, who was not. And abuses took place in this because some of the lowest of the low were employed in these places. Not everybody was like that. Not everybody, you know, not all Africans were involved in the trust. Of course they weren't. And not all Europeans were involved in it. But these things happened. And we have to acknowledge them. And that's partly what the book is about.
And it matters to you very much, it seems, that you spent part of your childhood in Africa. Africa is still very much in your heart and soul.
Indeed. It made me. I mean, I grew up there. I became a human being there. This is where my consciousness began. What you don't know anything as a child. You're innocent and you're ignorant. But when you're an adult, you know you're not innocent, and it's your duty not to be ignorant. So you have to find out about the system that you're in now, or that you were in then. You have to try to understand it. As the James Baldwin quote says, if you don't try to understand both sides, or three sides of the conflict, you're not going to be able to escape from it.
You've come to this subject after many years, after many decades. You might have written this, I suppose, at any time. Has it been a very painful process for you?
Yes, it has.
You've suffered.
It's been quite difficult to do on several levels. On a personal level, during lockdown, I think my wife would probably say I went mad, more or less. Grew my hair, but you're reading about terrible things and exploring terrible things, and then you have to acknowledge what your country has done too. This can be difficult. I mean,
and that you were unwittingly a part of it. You were sitting on the top of the pyramid.
You're in a system that you don't, as a child. You're merely a child. You're not responsible for it, but as an adult, you are responsible for looking at it and trying to understand it, and the effects of it. And the lasting effects of it, because these things don't go away. I mean, Kenya's celebrating next month, 60 years of its independence. But so this royal visit, which was a kind of, clearing of the way, the king was taken through a museum, the Ujamaa Museum, and he was taken through the Hall of Fame and the Hall of Shame. So we have to look at the fame and the shame of the British Empire too. And, look at it. It's not a problem. You just have to acknowledge what was done and the grief that it caused, and there were good things, of course, and there were bad things.
Yes, I mean, can you say a sentence or two more about the balance, how you would regard the British Empire, how we should think about it?
Look, Michael, our lives, one's own life goes into history, as my childhood toys are now in the Museum of Childhood. It's absurd. The British Empire is gone. If you look at it, it lasted 300 years. It's now disappearing in time. What will remain of the British Empire? The best thing of the British Empire, the best result, is the English language. I mean, English is a world language because of the British Empire. The Americans were part of the first empire. It's spoken in India, Africa, Australia, everywhere. And it's a language that's drawn from everywhere, all other languages. Its roots are everywhere. And it's a marvellous language. And our job as writers is a way to serve the English language. That is a result of empire, in a sense. But that's, as it were, the honey from the beehive, not the mess and anger of the beehive.
You say that the empire has gone. Indeed it has. I wonder whether the Commonwealth is going. I mean, the royal family must feel a little bit reluctant to go around the Commonwealth now because they're having a bit of a hard time. Some places they may be jeered. Some places they have to stick to these formulaic non-apologies. Right. It's quite tricky for them, isn't it?
Well, of course, but they have to suck it up in a way. I mean, this is what... Look at the Commonwealth. What was interesting the other week was the cenotaph. When it's not just the prime ministers and the royals that go, the Commonwealth send their people and they stand there. You've got to understand, the Second World War, the British Empire came together. People of all colours, all races, okay, from India, from the Caribbean, they served, they fought, they died, they put their money into buying Spitfires. And the thing about the Commonwealth is, I mean, it may be seen as Empire Mark II, but there are countries who are joining it that were never part of the British Empire.
Absolutely.
And they turned up at the cenotaph too. And so what the King was trying to say in his speech at the end of it was, look, we have to get over this and carry on in friendship. And that's what we have to do. You can't just sit there in enmity forever. Once former enemies have to talk to each other.
We have to escape from the trap because, just to remind you, the book is called Trapped in History, Kenya, Mau and Me. Many thanks, Nicholas Rankin, particularly for coming in on Sunday lunchtime. Later in the show, we'll be examining some wonderful antiques. And before that, here's an update on your latest news headlines with Aaron Armstrong.
It is 12:31. Let's get you up to date with the headlines from the GB newsroom. The Chancellor says the government is acting responsibly amid suggestions tax cuts will be announced in next week's autumn statement. Jeremy Hunt says he won't introduce any kind of measure that risks fueling inflation after it was halved over the past year. The Chancellor also hinted inheritance and business tax could be slashed in an effort to boost the economy, but insists next week's statement will focus on growth.
We're not going to do anything irresponsible, particularly by which I mean anything that fuels inflation, because we had a big victory last week when we delivered the Prime Minister's pledge to halve inflation. When he and I came to office, it was over 11%. Now it's 4.6%. People watching at home, their number one concern, they say in poll after poll, is the cost of living crisis. This makes a difference. So we're going to do this responsibly.
Homeowners could be offered up to £1,000 a year off their household bills if they're prepared to live near new electricity pylons. The government's hoping the move will overcome planning objections and speed up infrastructure for charging electric vehicles. It could be worth up to £10,000 over a decade for some, although the Treasury hasn't specified where the money will come from. A woman who acted as a fixer for people smugglers has been jailed for 7.5 years. 32-year-old Ujeza Kermakaj, who's from Albania, helped arrange small boat crossings from France to the UK for Albanian nationals. She was arrested at her home in Oxfordshire last year and will be deported upon her release from prison. And 700,000 pupils in England are still being taught in poorly maintained or potentially unsafe buildings because of crumbling concrete. The Public Accounts Committee says it's limiting students' educational achievements. In its report, the cross-party group described a shocking lack of detail from the Department of Education, meaning the true state of the crisis remains a mystery. The Department for Education says its rebuilding programme is proceeding ahead of schedule. We'll have more in about half an hour's time, or there's more right now on our website, gbnews.com. Now, it's back to Michael.
Thank you very much, Aaron Armstrong. A new report by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on issues affecting men and boys has been published, seeking to address the consistent underperformance of boys in education. The report calls for creating boy-positive environments in schools, as well as challenging what it calls negative narrative and indifference that surrounds boys in society. Nick Fletcher MP co-authored the report, and he joins me now from his Don Valley constituency. Nick, welcome to GB News. Tell us about this underperformance. Why do we think it occurs, and who are the boys who are being left behind?
Well, it happens to many boys across the country. It's not just particularly in areas of deprivation, but it's something that is in clear sight. Everyone knows it's happening, and yet nobody seems to be particularly wanting to do anything about it. And this report shines a light on it, and it does put some good recommendations there for what we can do to stop it happening. They are behind at every single level, all the way through the school years, and there's 35,000 boys a year, less than girls, going to university as well. So it's continuing from the very young all the way through to early adulthood.
So we have this strange paradox, because we're still worried that men are overrepresented in management, on boards and so on, and yet you're telling us that 35,000 fewer boys are going to university than girls. Tell us a little bit about how this issue might be tackled.
Well, we spoke to quite a few different heads who are leading schools where they've actually managed to reduce the gap or eliminate it completely. And they've done that without any further resources, really. They've just decided to take this issue head on. So, and then from there, they've put in a boy-positive attitude. All the teaching staff in these schools have recognised that there's an issue, and instead of expecting, well, it's a boy, they'd mess about at the back of the class, we don't expect them to do as well as girls, they've actually tackled it and said, no, we do expect you boys to do as well as the girls. We do expect good behaviour, and it's had a real impact. And when we have, there's been some young boys who have been struggling with literacy and different issues, and they've decided, well, look, there's no point in just keeping on pushing further and further on into courses. What we need to do is stay with that young person and put some catch-up interventions there to make sure that we're not moving on to the next stage of their education without getting the basics right first.
So we are here, I suppose, talking about expectations and low aspirations, is that right?
Yes, that's definitely right. And I've seen it all too often in places like Doncaster, and I think that's happened across the north. But as I say, you do get these pockets of deprivation all across the country, and it's something that we need to stop doing. We need to expect the best of everybody. We need everybody to achieve the maximum that they're able to achieve, and we can do it. We've just got to have the right attitude.
The right attitude, yes, but of course you said that already some of the right things were being done by the right people. I'm just thinking, isn't this all a question of leadership? Do we have enough good leaders in schools?
Well, I went to one of my schools the other day, actually, just by coincidence, and I spoke to the head there about this report that was coming out, and they'd managed to do the same thing as well. So it does happen. As I say, we just need to recognise the problem, really, and then we need to, as I say, I've been campaigning for a Minister for Men and Boys as part of the APPG as well, and we need to focus on this. As I say, you said right at the top of the programme, because we've got more male MPs, because there's more male chairs of large companies, we think that it's not an issue, and it is an issue. And if we don't address it, we're going to have some serious problems in the next 10, 15 years' time.
Yeah, you faced a certain amount of ridicule for suggesting a minister for men and boys. You've made a pretty good case just now for why we might have a minister for boys. What are the issues that are carried on into manhood?
Well, I mean, we've as a second report that the all-party parliamentary group did was on the men's health strategy, and I'm really pleased to announce today that the government have actually read the report, which was produced in February, and they've put out some points today that they're going to really jump on. They are going to get us a men's ambassador, which is fantastic news. We are putting screening out there. They're going to do a screening campaign for men over 50 with regards to prostate cancer. So there's lots of issues that we raised in the men's health strategy report that the government have read and they've taken on board, because, as we know, men don't talk as much as what women do. We've got 13 men a day taking their own life, which is tragic. We've got 88 men a day dying of heart disease. We've got 33 men a day dying of prostate cancer. So there's lots of issues. So a minister for men would look after boys, but would also help raise the issues that men face. And as I say, I'm really pleased with what the government have announced this weekend. It proves that lots of these reports, lots of all-party parliamentary group put reports together, and they just end up being put on the shelf. Well, we've had some real success with this today, and I'd like to thank all the people that have helped put that together.
Yeah, well done on that. Just going back to the boys, I want to raise a general point. You have said that there are examples of best practice. Why is it that best practice doesn't spread more easily around the system than it appears to?
I don't know. I really don't know. It's not even part of the Ofsted measure, you see. I think if it was part of Ofsted, when they went out and checked on scores and they literally just had a tick box, how are boys measuring up with girls, then they would get people would start actually looking at this. So maybe that's something else that we can get put forward. And once we start measuring things like that, then we'll start getting best practice shared, because obviously everybody wants a school with a good Ofsted rating.
Thank you very much. Nick Fletcher, MP. Stay with us for a look at some beautiful artefacts as an antiques dealer comes to the studio determined to boost the antiques fair circuit, which has been flagging since the COVID lockdowns.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. It's my pleasure to have a tiny trove of antiques that have been brought in by Tom Smith of Dovecote Antiques. These are amongst items that will be available to buy at the Antiques and Fine Arts Fair at the NEC in Birmingham, beginning on the 1st of December. Tom was meant to be joined by John Andrews, who's organising the fair, but he's been betrayed by the British railway system and sadly was unable to make it. Tom, you are all the more welcome.
Thank you. Good morning.
Tell me a little bit about what's going on in the antiques world. I get the impression then that since COVID, people are not going back to the fairs in the numbers that they used to do.
Yeah, that's very much the case. And although we have a very strong roster of fairs in the UK, both from large fairs at showgrounds to smaller, more specialist fairs, I think during COVID, people's habits changed. They got out of perhaps the rhythm of collecting in this way they used to. And it's been a bit of a challenge to tempt them back. Also, quite a lot of shifts have been found with things going online, business being done online, so people are able to access antiques in different ways, which is then going to be a challenge for the more traditional setting of an antique fair. That being said, it is still the best place to go to be able to handle things, see things in person, talk to the dealers, and learn from my colleagues and myself about the pieces that people are interested in.
You don't think there's simply been a decline in interest in antiques?
I think inevitably styles and tastes change, and I think that antiques can sometimes be categorised as old-fashioned or can be treated in a way that people perhaps associate more with previous generations, their grandparents, for example. I certainly know I got my love of it from my grandparents, but I think that there is developments in that area. I think there are new collectors coming through. We have very strong international markets, and that is all sorts of ranges in age. But there is no doubt that stylistic shifts, collecting shifts happen, and as antique dealers and people in any industry, we have to be able to shift and kind of modernise with that.
I think I've been caught out by some of these shifts. When I was in my 20s and 30s, we were buying what is now called brown furniture. But, dark wood was absolutely the thing for us. And now, apparently, you can't... Well, I don't want to exaggerate, but it's not as popular as it used to be.
No, I think that is the case. I think also the way we live has changed significantly. So, for example, I think probably the brown furniture you're talking about might be a large mahogany dining table or a big double-fronted wardrobe or something. I lived in London for 11 years and we lived in a flat. People don't have the same square footage of living space that they perhaps did 20, 30 years ago. The way people live has changed, and that will have an impact on whether you can physically fit some of the furniture of previous decades into your house.
You brought some very small pieces with you.
I have, yes.
These would fit into most properties.
They would.
What do you want to begin with?
I set up my company, Dovecote Antiques, and we specialise in what collectively in the industry is known as smalls. And that includes jewellery, silver and porcelain. But one of the reasons, like you point out, is that they will fit in any home. So, the first piece I can start off with is this lovely brooch. It's 18-karat gold, diamonds and rubies. And it was made by...
The camera's more important than me.
It was made by a company called Alabaster & Wilson, who were founded in the 1870s. And they still exist. They're still making pieces today. But this was made in 1960 and was retailed through Garrard's, who at the time were the Crown Jewellers. So it's interesting because it shows a transition from kind of the perhaps more conservative, traditional style of the 1950s, but you're starting to get hints of the modernism of the 1960s.
What might you expect to pay for that?
This will probably be in the region of £2,000 to £2,500. It's very good quality, very good maker, and obviously the retailer and its original case also, is important to the collection as a whole. My actual main area of study is in ceramics. I did my master's in English ceramics, and here we have...
Be careful, because the top comes
Yeah,
off.
it does. So there is a lid, and it's a little unstable, but I think we should be OK.
Now, what era is that?
So this dates from 1906.
Oh, really?
It's a very classic example of the Edwardian taste, which looks back at the 18th century rather than the perhaps slightly heavier styles of the 19th century. It's in a very bright ground colour that's influenced by 18th century Sèvres from France. And it's made by a name that I think quite a lot of your watchers might know, and that's Royal Crown Derby.
Yes.
So Royal Crown Derby is one of the oldest English ceramics factories. They were founded in the 1750s, and they are still making today. They're still based in Derby on Osmaston Road, and this is a lovely example at one of the peaks of their competence. And it's hand-painted and signed by one of their top artists called Hardy.
How much?
This will be in the high hundreds.
High hundreds?
High hundreds.
Getting towards 1,000?
Getting towards 1,000, yeah.
Very good. And the next item?
Finally, we have a silver and enamel box. So silver and enamel is quite a popular collecting area because you get a lot of variety and a lot of different styles.
Is the interior worth seeing?
Yeah, this probably would have been a small cigarette box because it's lined with wood.
Yes.
But most of things like this now are collected purely for their artistic value. This is quite unusual because it depicts actually an 18th century painting called The Gamekeepers, and is made in 1929 by a factory in Birmingham, a maker called Henry Clifford Davis, and it has a technique known as guilloche enamel, which is probably familiar to your watchers from the works of Fabergé. If you think of Fabergé eggs,
yes,
they're using the same technique that is made on this. And this has that slightly Art Deco design in the engine turning on the sides, but the enamel is done after an 18th century old master painting.
And how much might that set us back?
This one would be in the kind of the mid-hundreds, around £600-700, something like that.
I'm just going to read this offer, because Tom has made available 500 tickets for GB News viewers. If you're interested in going to the Antiques and Fine Arts Fair at the NEC in Birmingham, you email classicantiquefairs@btinternet.com and put Sunday with Michael Portillo in the subject header. So that's Classic Antique Fairs, that's all one word, at btinternet.com, and you put Sunday with Michael Portillo in the header. I hope the email address is on the bottom of the screen at the moment. The first 500 to email will receive a free two-person ticket. Tom, you mentioned your grandparents. How did you, young as you are, come to be an antiques dealer?
Well, I've always been a collector, and I've always been interested in history, and the two seem to kind of merge together. I bought my first piece of porcelain at the age of 12, and then actually I went to an NEC antique fair when I was 18, and bought a plate by a factory called Minton, who I've subsequently written my master's thesis on and collect and deal in. So, you know, fairs like the Antiques Fair at the NEC, the Classic Antiques Fair, which is following a very long pedigree of fairs at the NEC in Birmingham. You know, they go back decades. It has really been a centre for antiques collecting for many years and remains so, which is why we're so excited about this new fair. You know, going to places like that is what got me interested. You can see such a variety of pieces, and it's a really great place to go.
Tom, absolutely marvellous. Thank you for bringing in those lovely pieces, and I hope that you do have a very good fair. That's Tom Smith. So that's the end of the programme, and I'd like to thank all of my guests who've come in today. I'm always so touched when people do come in on Sunday morning and at Sunday lunchtime to have a good conversation. In a very few moments, Darren Grimes will be here. He's taking over. He'll take you on, I think, for the next 2 hours. I will certainly be back next Sunday. I look forward to that very much indeed. In the meantime, I hope you all have a wonderful week.
Hello Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. I'm Craig Snell. Well, looking ahead to the new working week, we are going to start off rather grey and damp. For some of us, it will be drier midweek, but for all, it looks like it's going to turn colder as we head towards next weekend. Back to the here and now, we still are dominated by this huge area of low pressure. Note the tightly packed isobars indicating it's going to be fairly blustery as we end at Sunday. Quite a lot of cloud around with some outbreaks of rain, keeping a very close eye on this next area of rain, however, as it moves into parts of South Wales, southwestern England throughout the night. Could turn quite squally for a time. But with all the cloud and rain around, it's going to be another fairly mild one right across the UK. So we start Monday morning, potentially quite wet across parts of southern England, but that will clear off towards France as we head towards the middle part of the morning. That may briefly allow some sunnier spell to develop across parts of the Midlands, East Anglia for a time, but for a lot of the UK, it's going to be a fairly grey start to the new working week. Further outbreaks of rain, that may well be fairly persistent up across parts of northern Scotland. And with a northerly wind starting to develop, it will be slightly cooler than the weekend, but still on the mild side. Into Tuesday, another fairly grey picture for parts of England and Wales, risk of some outbreaks of rain in the east. Brighter and drier for Scotland and Northern Ireland. That will sink its way southwards into England and Wales as we go into Wednesday.